There's a train station in Detroit so massive it once symbolized the city's unstoppable rise, and now it stands as the perfect symbol of how it all fell apart. Detroit was the fourth largest city in America, a city so wealthy that people called it the Paris of the West.
Then you will find the heart of America here, in the city of Detroit, Michigan.
The auto industry made it one of the richest cities in the world, and then it collapsed so much that it became the largest city in American history to declare bankruptcy.
Detroit has filed for bankruptcy. It is now the largest city in U.S. history to file for Chapter 9 bankruptcy.
Today, Detroit provides police and fire services across an area the size of San Francisco and Boston combined, with only enough people to fill Boston. 40% of the streetlights don't work. When you call the police for an emergency, you might wait nearly an hour. Almost a third of the city is just empty land now. So how does a city that powerful just disappear? How do you lose over 1 million people in population? And what happens to everything they leave behind? This is a story about how American cities rise and fall, and why some of them carry the seeds of their own undoing from the very beginning. Transforming manufacturing itself with the assembly line and mass production. The idea that regular working people could afford to buy the products they built. All of that came from Detroit. By 1950, Detroit's population hit its peak at nearly 2 million people. It was the fourth largest city in the country, trailing only New York, Chicago, and Philadelphia. Population size alone doesn't capture how wealthy this place was. In the 1950s and 60s, Detroit ranked among the richest cities in the entire world. General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler, the big three of the automobile industry, were all headquartered in Detroit. General Motors alone was so massive that its annual revenue exceeded the entire economy of Belgium. The auto industry generated so much money that factory workers, including black auto workers, earned high wages with full retirement benefits and health care. These were people without college degrees living solidly middle-class lives, buying homes, and sending their kids to good schools. The city itself reflected this wealth. Massive neoclassical buildings rose downtown. The Michigan Central Rail Station, designed by the same architects behind New York's Grand Central, opened as a monument to progress. Industrial complexes like the Packard plant sprawled across dozens of acres. The architecture was so grand that people genuinely called Detroit the Paris of the West. This was a city that believed it owned the future, and for a while, it did. But when an entire city builds itself around a single industry, its fate becomes inseparable from that industry's trajectory. The warning signs appeared almost as soon as Detroit hit its peak. The way Detroit was built, the city's economy was overwhelmingly reliant on the auto industry. When you're that dependent on a single sector, you're building a house of cards. Over the next 2 decades, Detroit lost over 130,000 manufacturing jobs as companies started moving operations out to the suburbs where land was cheaper and unions were weaker. The economic shift was only part of the story. Racial segregation was tearing the city apart. After World War II, Detroit's white middle class started leaving the city center. The federal government was building highways that made suburban commutes easy. Developers were offering cheap new homes in all-white neighborhoods outside the city limits, and racist housing policies actively prevented black families from following them. The breaking point came in the summer 1967. The city erupted in what became the largest civil disturbance of the 20th century. 43 people died, and the Michigan National Guard and the U.S. Army had to intervene. The uprising was a response to decades of police brutality, housing discrimination, and economic exclusion. White families saw the riots and accelerated their departure, leaving behind a population that was increasingly black, poor, and abandoned by the tax base that had funded city services. Meanwhile, the auto industry itself was beginning to crumble. Automation started replacing assembly line workers in the 70s, and global competition from Germany and Japan was eating into Detroit's market share. The energy crisis made big American cars suddenly look wasteful and outdated. Companies restructured, moving more operations overseas or to states with cheaper labor. Detroit had built its entire infrastructure assuming the good times would last forever. And now that the good times were ending, it was in trouble. The math stopped making sense somewhere around the 1970s. Detroit covers nearly 140 square miles. That's a massive area, and every inch of it has streets that need plowing, pipes that need maintenance, and lights that need power. The city had built all of that infrastructure for nearly 2 million people. By 2020, fewer than 650,000 people lived there. Imagine running a city built for 2 million while collecting taxes from a fraction of that number. You still have to provide police, fire services, water, electricity, and road maintenance across the same geographic area. But there's a problem. Your tax revenue has collapsed. Between 1950 and 2005, Detroit's property tax revenue was cut in half. By 2011, property taxes were only being paid on about half of all taxable properties. People either couldn't afford to pay or had abandoned their homes and left. The city couldn't keep up. By 2013, 40% of the streetlights weren't working. The average police response time for top priority emergency calls was 58 minutes, nearly an hour. Help might eventually arrive became the operating assumption. The landscape itself became a monument to abandonment. The Michigan Central Rail Station, that grand neoclassical marvel, was abandoned in 1988 and left to rot. The Packard plant, once a symbol of American industrial might, closed in the 50s and became a sprawling ruin. By 2012, a third of the entire city was just vacant land. 3 years later, 1 in 3 Detroit properties was foreclosed. The Detroit Land Bank ended up holding over 70,000 vacant properties, land and structures with no owners, no purpose, and no future. In 2013, Detroit filed for bankruptcy. It was the largest municipal bankruptcy in American history. $18 billion in debt, including a $3.5 billion pension shortfall. Detroit had become the most racially segregated major city in America, with the highest poverty rate and the highest percentage of vacant homes. But the economic decline was just a symptom. The real disease ran deeper than bankruptcy or poverty. When 1 million people leave a city, they don't take the roads with them. They don't take the sewers or the power lines or the streetlights. All of that stays behind, waiting for someone to maintain it. Detroit had built highways, sewers, electrical grids, and water systems for nearly 2 million people. Those systems didn't scale down with the population. The pipes still needed maintenance. The roads still cracked and needed paving. The streetlights still drew power, but the money to pay for all of that was gone. This created something urban planners call a death spiral. As services got worse, more people left. As more people left, tax revenue dropped further. And as tax revenue dropped, services deteriorated even more. The city tried raising taxes to cover the shortfall, which only pushed more people to leave. There was no way out. Detroit became what planners call a shrinking city, or a legacy city, a place built for an industrial economy that no longer exists. Saddled with infrastructure it can no longer afford. The city launched massive demolition campaigns, tearing down thousands of abandoned structures. But demolition costs money too, and even when you tear down a building, you still have to maintain the street it sat on, the sewer beneath it, and the power lines that ran to it. The city was trapped, too big to maintain, too broke to fix, and too empty to ever fill again. Most cities would have just kept spiraling. Detroit tried something different. Detroit first stopped trying to rebuild what it lost. Then the city started asking a different question. What if we stop pretending the past is coming back? City planners introduced a policy called Rightsizing. The concept is simple yet radical. Accept that Detroit will never again house 2 million people. Focus resources on the areas where people actually live. Concentrate investment in neighborhoods that can be saved. Let other areas return to nature. Shrink the city to a size it can actually afford to maintain. Detroit received over $800 million in federal recovery funds to help with this transition. The money is being used to demolish abandoned buildings, clean up vacant lots, and prepare sites for new development. The city is working to return tens of thousands of vacant properties to productive use, sometimes transforming empty lots into community gardens or green spaces. Investment is returning, though it's heavily concentrated in the downtown area. General Motors has invested hundreds of millions into its local plants, and Ford is partnering with Google to develop an innovation district focused on new mobility technologies. Historic industrial buildings are being converted into spaces for tech startups and small businesses. But there's an uncomfortable truth. This represents a partial recovery, concentrated in specific areas. The revitalization is creating what people call a tale of two cities. Downtown and a few surrounding neighborhoods are seeing new investment, rising home prices, and job growth, but large parts of the city remain abandoned, poor, and disconnected from that progress. Detroit's story is a warning to other industrial cities in the Rust Belt, places like Cleveland, St. Louis, and Pittsburgh, that are also shrinking while still maintaining more stability. The lesson is clear: you cannot build a city's entire economy on a single industry. When that industry leaves or dies, it takes everything with it. The cities that will survive are the ones that learn to adapt, diversify, and accept that growth isn't always the goal. Sometimes survival means learning to shrink gracefully rather than collapsing catastrophically. Detroit built itself on the promise that the auto industry would last forever. It didn't. The city that once owned the future became a reminder to what happens when that future arrives differently than planned. And now, slowly and painfully, Detroit is building a different kind of future, one that fits the city it actually is, shaped by lessons from what it used to be. The American dream was built in Detroit's factories, and Detroit is learning what happens when that dream moves somewhere else.